Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government. You still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? Does anybody else see a problem here? If the government has nothing to hide,
most science, at least in the U.S., is developed, most of the high science anyway, is developed through military research labs, military contracts, and some contracts to the National Science Foundation. But all of the military work and much of the work done by the National Science Foundation and others represent compartmentalization, separation of the sciences in small bits and pieces, so basically one side doesn't know what the other is doing. In fact, the first paper I ever presented at 19 was on the contrasting sort of our approach of compartmentalization in our approach to science and the Russian approach, or the Soviet approach at that time, which was to use generalists, to take people from all disciplines, integrate them into the same room so that you could develop the higher ordered thinking, because then you brought all of these various disciplines, even when they didn't seem to fit, you brought them together and they tended to feed off of each other in a way that built better and more comprehensive science. In fact, as it relates to electromagnetic exposures, the science developed in the Soviet Union said, and they set the regulations, not that they enforced them, but they at least had them on the books, they were 1,000 times more stringent than the U.S. standards in the same areas because of that integrated approach. When you look at the productive capacity of the USSR during the Cold War, they couldn't produce their way, into an outhouse. It was a mess. But what they could do is compete on science. And the way they competed on science with us, and were able to not only excel in some areas, surpass us in others, and stay up with us in most, was by integrated science, as opposed to compartmentalization. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, and it yields usually better results. On the U.S. side, we do the opposite. We continue that model of compartmentalization to the detriment of really good science, and at a huge, huge economic cost. The duplication within that system, the cost of man-hours within that system, and the waste that's created in that system. Now, what does that all mean in the broader context of global science? The U.S. spends in the regular defense budget somewhere around $700 billion a year, which is a big number. We've got a couple wars going on top of that. The Chinese spend about 70, 80 billion is what our intelligence tells us, at least that's what's publicly released. When you run inefficient science, and the Chinese don't run inefficient science, they steal everything they can that's already been developed and then take it from there. And they do it at rice bowl wages. They're not paying top flight scientists $250,000, $500,000 a year in salary and benefits, and they're not paying Davis-Bacon wage rates to build ships. They're building them for a bowl of rice. And what you get in China for 70 billion is what you get in the U.S. for probably far in excess of what we actually spend, because you can't measure it in dollars or currencies. You have to measure it in productive output. And what the Chinese are doing with their productive output is making sure that they can move millions of men and women in their armed services anywhere they want to put them on the planet. That's what's going on there. For every ship they build, we think about it because they actually build hardware and they build it faster than virtually anyone on the planet. And it's causing a lot of concern, because when you start to think about how does all this play into the geopolitics of the planet, climate change and energy and the issues that we've been talking about the last couple of days, they really do fit together. China is moving to energy independence. They're building a coal to liquids plant every 18 months from start to finish. They have so many planned online. Their objective is to be free of the West in terms of contributions to basic natural resources. And what are they doing with all the trillions of debt, U.S. debt, that they're collecting? What are they doing with all the dollars that they're collecting? They're going around the world. They're outbidding Western companies by outbidding us on mining opportunities, the venture capital opportunities, the rare earths and mineral opportunities, and all those plays all over the world. They're outbidding everyone. And why are they doing it? Why would you want to hold a bunch of U.S. paper right now that you know is going to be dropping in value? You're better off buying the commodities. You know, when the market fell apart and copper hit $1.30 a pound, which was the lowest it had been in years, the Chinese bought more then than they ever bought in their history, and they bought it all the way up till it blew through the old record price by 10% while the economy is still in the toilet in the U.S. and Europe, and commodity prices are breaking through the roof. And all those investments those Chinese made with all those cheap U.S. dollars, well, they still had a little bit of value. And we all thought they were nuts for paying 10, 20% more than the market said those assets were worth. What a deal they made on all those commodities, not just what was already finished. And what does it mean, just copper alone? There's 8 days worth of copper in warehouses in the world to fulfill 8 days worth of global demand right now today. That's how underproducing we are in that specific commodity. Zinc, nickel are in similar situations where there's very limited supplies on hand. Rare earths, it's even worse, and all of those are controlled by China. When you start to think about earth-penetrating tomography as a technology for locating underground mineral resources, as an example, oil and gas resources, some of that technology was tested, and it was tested in over 20 states on a number of wells that were drilled by Halliburton back in the 80s and into the 90s. And what they looked at was using a very simple method of earth-penetrating tomography. They were able to look and with absolute 99.9% accuracy, grade and quantity and quality of oil and gas layers through the earth, matching up perfectly against actual drill logs from when they physically drilled those wells using this type of technology. Now imagine, and remember what we were talking about earlier about the public owns energy resources in most instances. In Alaska, in all instances, are publicly owned. But if you could with certainty image the underground geologic structures and know exactly where oil and gas is, now you no longer have risk associated with the drilling activity, which is why everyone says, you know, we ought not to be in the energy business. But when you can define where those deposits are, then you can maximize or optimize what you get on the lease, because now everyone has good information. People want to bid on that lease competitively. You're going to optimize the public's return on those resources. So using our technology for doing some things maybe makes a lot of sense, but there's lots of ways to do earth-penetrating tomography and to identify those mineral resources, oil and gas resources. HAARP is one of those technologies that perhaps we could use in this way. When Skylab launched the first time, we realized that, back in the 70s, we realized that it created a hole in the ozone layer. And everybody watched it, you know, and they said, oh, after a few hours it all filled in and everything went back to normal. But think about this now. I mean, think about it as a practical matter. The Earth is turning, you make a hole, everything's moving, eventually it gets filled in, or it appears to get filled in. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Think about if I dip a cup of water out of a pond, you know, and all the water levels back out. Did it fill back up? Well, if I keep dipping those cups of water out of that pond, eventually there is no pond. But it sure looks flat and level with just a couple dipped out. So what was it? You know, I thought Skylab creates an ozone hole. How many billions of cans of aerosol would have had to get up there? And it didn't start down here, you know. It started up there where you actually delivered particulate material to the place that you're trying to affect and created a chemical reaction. 3,000 satellite and rocket launches, over 3,000 worldwide, did more for the ozone depletion on the planet, I assure you, than all the air spray that everybody ever discharged. And again, nobody takes any responsibility. Blame it on the guy with the aerosol can, while governments stand back and go, we didn't do anything here. This is the problem and the arrogance of it all. And often it's the case where the other guy is blamed for something that our own government has done. In fact, if you look at environmental issues generally, you know, virtually all the Superfund sites, 90% of them, are government sites where the government made the mess, and then the rest of us get to clean it up. Now we're experimenting with science that's much, much different than leaving a mess in some local location on the ground We're manipulating the entire geophysical systems of the planet and trying to learn how to do it better, how to dial it up a little more efficiently, how to control those outcomes with a more precision and a more higher resolution as our science advances. We've written the book Controlling the Human Mind, and we wrote and produced the video Mindcontrol, which Alex has carried for years. And I always consider that the most important work. Even when you associate some of the mind effects things with HAARP, they're big and they're important. But as we got more into that subject, it became, for me, the most compelling and important work that we've published. Because the idea of interfering with human consciousness, this idea of being able to interfere with free will, if you will, something that even God will not do in most religious traditions, interfere with free will, is now within the capability of man. Should man do it? I say absolutely not. Again, thinking about personal liberty and personal freedom, the basic premise of the First Amendment of the Constitution, the right of free speech, the right of assembly, the right of free expression of religion, all of those presuppose a fundamental right, the freedom to think. That's the First Amendment, because it presupposes all of that. Without the freedom to think, none of the other liberties matter at all. And this is the century that we're in. The CIA, actually the work in this goes before the CIA. You go back to the work at Harvard, work being done at the hypnotherapy labs at Harvard in the 1920s by a guy named Estabrook. And Estabrook had this idea that you could create what we would call today the Manchurian candidate, some super spy that would be pre-programmed to do destruction or gather intelligence, and if captured would have absolutely no knowledge of any of it. Well, he started this work in the 20s. By the 1930s, his work was classified. By the 1960s, the material he had published, he acknowledged that he created these super spies, that he spent 9 to 10 months, and 1 out of 5 people were subject to this level of programming, where he would subject them to 9 to 10 months of programming where he literally split the personality into 2 separate human beings within the same body, programming one to be the super spy where they could function in another country without detection, and if captured would have no memory of their true self. And yet when they returned to the United States, this altered consciousness could be re-triggered to remember everything they collected in the foreign country and their true self. The problem is you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once you fracture a human being in this way, you've effectively destroyed them forever. He believed this was a good idea, and he advanced this technology. And the same material that he published advancing the idea that using LSD to alter people's consciousness for mind control experiments was legitimized and reasonable and a good thing. That's what he wrote in his published work. At the same time, the Central Intelligence Agency later was revealed to be experimenting with LSD on 8,000 men and women in the armed services alone, not to mention the civilian sector. This came out in a congressional report that was on activities within the CIA right after Watergate. When, remember Watergate, there's ex-CIA operatives breaking into this building for the bagmen of the Nixon administration. Well, there are no ex-CIA guys, number one, unless they're dead. And number two, the fact is when they got caught, what they got caught doing were mind control experiments. The church committees and the Congress actually heard the testimony as the CIA busied themselves shredding the documents because they acknowledged over 140 programs under MK Ultra and its sub-programs that were directly involved in the manipulation of human behavior using chemical means and electromagnetic means. And one of the organizations they worked through at the time was the Mankind Research Association, operated out of Bethesda, Maryland, which was a front for Navy intelligence organizations and the Central Intelligence Organization developing mind control technologies and an understanding of what those would be about, more than a Manchurian candidate, manipulating people over huge geographic areas for very specific outcomes. At the same time, they were engaged in a great deal of research on what they called paraphysics.